In 2017, the Melee community made several rule set decisions which would end up having long-term implications. Back then, the advent of box-style controllers forced the community into a difficult situation which it couldn't possibly have been prepared for at the time. The community generally agreed that box controllers needed to be legal for their ergonomic benefits, but unfortunately their competitive advantages were obvious. The company Hitbox initially advertised these competitive advantages as a good thing. However, the Smashbox's perfect precision and unrealistic analog stick motions left many players worried that it wouldn't be legal in the long term. I rapidly brainstormed the long-term implications of these controllers back then, and I eventually came to the conclusion that they could only be legal if they took a more balanced approach. I would end up parting ways with Hitbox largely due to our differing philosophies, and from there I spent years designing my own iteration called the Box. The Box's intellectual property would end up becoming the standard among box-style controllers that are used today. As part of the ongoing legality process, I became involved in discussions pertaining to GameCube controller mods as well. This happened because I'd concluded that not all of the means of balancing the box could be applied firmware side, as certain improvements needed to be given to the GameCube controller on a software level. On June 9, 2017, I released a video titled The GameCube Controller Project, which advocated for certain faulty mechanics to be fixed. This video most notably made a push for Vanilla Melee's dashback problem to be fixed by increasing dashback's window to 2 frames. Prominent community members such as Cardano had previously advocated for dashback to be increased to 2 frames, and this fix had been included on the 20XX ISO which came out in 2014. However, there wasn't a need to legalize 2-frame dashback at the time. The advent of box-style controllers created a need to standardize these types of changes because the community was now introducing a new controller archetype, and there just so happened to be no other way to balance the GameCube controller alongside it. The suggestions I raised in my video from June 9, 2017 quickly sparked the interest of other community leaders. 3 days later, Practical Task acknowledged that dashback failure is similar to tripping in Brawl. Practical Task also mentioned that if the community decided to act on dashback, that it would open up the door for other faulty mechanics to be fixed as well. From there, crucial discussions would ensue behind the scenes. I joined up with Practical Task as well as several others such as Cardano and Taucon in order to discuss the implications of these controller fixes. However, there would quickly end up being disagreements in our philosophies. My stance was that the team distributing these mods had an obligation to educate the community on less well-known fixes. I was aware of the fact that 1.0 Cardinal and Dash Out of Crouch were faulty, for example. Unfortunately, just about everyone else on the team wanted to take a more minimalistic approach, as they felt that it would be hard enough to convince the Melee community to mod the game in any capacity. This ultimately led to us parting ways. The community leaders I briefly worked with would go on to launch the mod known as UCF. UCF started off with a minimalistic approach by addressing the 2 most infamous flaws in the GameCube controller, dashback and shield drop. UCF would debut at Shine 2017, which took place that summer. Aside from some initial logistical issues and technical difficulties, UCF was generally met with good reception, as it solved the controller lottery which had plagued the community up until that point. This marked a huge turning point for the community, as it showed that a software mod could be standardized after all. Despite UCF's warm reception, I was adamant about the fact that there was still plenty of work to be done. I was authoring the Box Manifesto at the time, and within it I included a chapter which discussed the long-term implications of UCF. I wrote that while UCF was a step in the right direction, there were several problems with it which would eventually manifest. I suggested that the community would inevitably need to address less well-known mechanics such as 1.0 Cardinal and Dash Out of Crouch. Furthermore, the community would eventually have to reevaluate the claim that UCF wasn't making the game easier. While this claim may have helped ease the community into accepting a software mod as the standard, it was misinformative in the long term. After all, UCF increased dashback's timing window as well as shield drop's range, and so by definition it made both of these techniques easier. Although I had lost jurisdiction over the community's standardized patch, I continued to brainstorm what it ought to do as the years went on. My friend Altmore and I would eventually launch a product called 1.03 in 2021. 1.03 didn't have the same level of marketing power or community backing that UCF did, but Altmore and I remained confident that it was an underappreciated gem. As time went on, the two of us continued to update 1.03 by adding new faulty mechanics that we found. There would end up being 13 of these in total. Fast forward another few years, and the Melee community is now on the cusp of implementing rule set changes which are intended to make box-style controllers more balanced. On September 26th, Practical Tasks announced a final set of changes to the Controller Rule Set Committee's proposals, which have been in the works for some time now. Part of what I'll be explaining in this video is why the only change I agree with on this entire changelog is the decision to ban the Y value of 0.3. The committee recognized that this coordinate could produce an Ice Climber's desync which I failed to catch back when I was designing the box. The community is correct that this coordinate should be banned. Aside from that, however, I must strongly advise for the community to veto the committee's changes to box controller firmware. To illustrate why I disagree with the committee's changes, let's rewind back to when crucial technology was introduced in 2017. First, the Smashbox was a functional concept, but it needed a full intellectual property overhaul. The box resolved the community's concerns with the Smashbox by implementing as many in-game nerfs as possible. From there, UCF was introduced as well in 2017. However, UCF wasn't a final product either. What the community failed to realize at the time was that UCF's long-term implication would be for it to equalize the GameCube controller with the box in the areas which can't be addressed firmware side. There are 13 game mechanics which fall under this category in total, and to this day, UCF only addresses some of them. The majority of the committee's changes don't fall under the category of game mechanics. Nerfs such as neutral SOCD, travel time simulation, and coordinate fuzzing all impede on the quality of life of box controllers, which is why many players aren't fond of them. Whereas in-game mechanic nerfs have always been met with open arms, the committee's nerfs have been met with disapproval, as they make a box controller feel bad to use. To give an example of a nerf which hasn't been well received, coordinate fuzzing makes it so that a box controller can't pinpoint the same coordinate reliably. Instead, the controller will run the risk of pinpointing any coordinate within a surrounding 3x3 grid. This introduces true RNG to the controller, which is the very definition of an anti-competitive change. To make matters even worse, there's the possibility that all of the committee's nerfs are exceeded by their air dodge angle buff. In other words, it's possible that the nerfware is actually buffware in the hands of a skilled user. To explain what I mean by this, the committee chose to desecrate very careful rationale when they buffed the box's air dodge from 30.5 degrees to 27 degrees. Although this 3.5 degree buff may not seem like much, it shouldn't be underestimated. I'll start by explaining why I chose the value of 30.5 degrees. My goal in choosing this value was to nerf air dodge by as much as possible while still keeping the box usable. It's best to design the controller this way because of the fact that its air dodge angle is automated, and so the user shouldn't be rewarded with a strong value for something that doesn't take skill to perform. I came to the conclusion that air dodge couldn't be made worse than 30.5 degrees because Fox's frame 6 ledge dash requires this angle in order to make it onto the stage. If Fox's air dodge is any steeper than 30.5 degrees, his ledge dash will fail, and so it's only fair to give him this angle. The committee buffed air dodge by 3.5 degrees like I mentioned, which is a change that I strongly disapprove of. Not only is 27 degrees inelegant due to the fact that it doesn't correspond with anything in-game, but the buff it gives surely exceeds at least a few of the committee's nerfs. This potentially defeats the purpose of the nerfware by itself, as the extra few degrees makes wave dashing considerably stronger. What all of this points towards is that the community and committee should give more consideration to the possibility that buffing the GameCube controller is the cleaner solution. Whereas there are no box nerfs left to give which don't involve neutering the controller, there are still plenty of ways to create parity by buffing the GameCube controller. Even the committee indirectly implies that there is still work to be done by titling the current version of UCF 0.84. Version numbers such as 0.73, 0.8, and 0.84 all imply that UCF is incomplete, which begs the question of why there isn't more of an effort being made to reach version 1.0. What I'll be doing from here is giving my take on what a version 1.0 of UCF ought to look like. On the current version of UCF, there are 6 faulty mechanics being addressed. In total, Melee has 13 faulty mechanics, with 2 of them having 2 faulty components. Those 2 are Smash DI and Dash Out of Crouch. This means that there are 15 faulty elements in total, and so UCF is outright missing 9 of them. Furthermore, there are improvements which can be made to 2 of UCF's existing fixes, Shield Drop and 1.0 Cardinal. From there, a Z-Jump toggle can be added software side for people's convenience. Aside from these gameplay changes, there are also 2 cultural shifts which I view as necessary in order for the community to solve its controller problem. The first one is the destigmatization of Z-jump, and the second one is the knowledge of the ADT shield button layout. I'll eventually cover both of these when the time comes. Then I'll explain that 3 of these software fixes actually buff the box as well. Finally, I'll explain the importance of Nintendo Wii's going forward. The Wii's processing power is needed in order to create stealth versions of 4 of the mechanic fixes. I'll go over this toward the end of the video. The good news which will come out of all of this is that the Melee community has a lot to look forward to. Whereas prominent community members seem to think that the box is bad news, the reality is that there is a revolution still to be had. By modernizing these faulty mechanics, not only can the GameCube controller and box coexist in harmony, but GameCube controller players can also enjoy a new game version which will rejuvenate Melee for years to come. This couldn't come at a better time, as Melee is now being faced with serious competitors such as Rivals of Aether 2, as well as spiritual sequels such as Fizzy's new project. While these games provide variety, I think it's safe to say that Melee players will always be most fond of ways to directly prolong Melee's longevity, which is exactly what these changes do. Before we get into the video, I'd appreciate if you could take a moment to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I also have a Twitch channel which I'll be overhauling after the release of this video. From here on out, I'll be streaming plenty of footage of me playing on the 1.03 ISO so that I can provide the community with proof that it works. From there, I plan to rip the footage to my YouTube channel. Without further ado, let's jump into the faulty mechanics. The first chapter of this video will cover the one-frame polling window issue which 4 different mechanics suffer from. This is the issue which most notably plagues dashback. However, it also applies to wiggle out of tumble, smash DI on frame 2 of hit lag, and Daraki wall jump. The issue is fixed by increasing these 4 mechanics to a 2-frame window, which is more appropriate for the analog stick motion they require. Worth noting is the fact that while 3 of these fixes currently exist on UCF, Daraki wall jump wasn't included due to its minimal importance. While it's true that Daraki wall jump is the least important of these 4 fixes, we ultimately shouldn't exclude a mechanic fix for this reason on the perfected version of UCF, and so Daraki wall jump makes the cut. The second chapter of this video will cover other polling issues. The first one is regular wall jump. Regular wall jump is programmed just fine in the sense that it has a 2-frame window, which is appropriate for its analog stick motion. However, Altimore discovered that there's a hidden issue with this mechanic, which we documented in June of 2023. This issue arises when your character receives an aerial drift pull on what would be the last eligible wall jump frame. Depending on your character's ECB position, it is possible for an aerial drift pull to cause wall jump to fail on this frame. This means that wall jump actually suffers from an identical issue to the 1-frame polling window issue in very rare cases. By programming the game to acknowledge when this aerial drift pull occurs, we can make wall jump a fair mechanic even in these situations. Next up is dash out of crouch. I view dash out of crouch as the most dysfunctional mechanic in Melee overall due to the fact that it suffers from 2 glaring issues. I'll start with the issue that's currently covered on UCF. This issue, which I call dash out of crouch Y, is the fact that there exists a 3-coordinate gap between crouch and dash. Unless this gap is addressed on a software level, there will be an unavoidable chance that your character stands up when you attempt to dash out of crouch. The UCF team is in agreement with me and Altimore that these 3 coordinates ought to be reprogrammed to keep your character in crouch so that this can't happen. The next dash out of crouch component is one that's currently addressed on 1.03 but not UCF. This component is in reference to the fact that a 2-frame window isn't sufficient for dash out of crouch's curved analog stick travel route. A fun fact is that the Goomwave developers addressed this issue through a macro-style fix which involves delaying the analog stick's horizontal movement. This shows that GameCube controller users are generally aware that dash out of crouch has some serious problems. In order to fix dash out of crouch through software, we have to increase its window to 3 frames. This will allow you to seamlessly dash out of crouch. Next, there is a polling issue with Special Out of Run that Altimore discovered in November 2023. Special Out of Run is a niche technique which can be performed by transitioning the analog stick from run to either the neutral B or vertical B ranges and pressing B on that exact frame as to avoid entering run break. While this analog stick motion will succeed most of the time, it can occasionally be stifled by a pull which takes place on one of the 2 X values that are still within the side B range. In order to make it so that this can't happen, Altimore and I made it so that the neutral B and vertical B ranges are widened by 2 values when your character is grounded. Finally, dash out of crouch isn't the only mechanic with 2 faulty components. Smash DI has a second faulty component which has to do with the magnitude of the SDI input. On vanilla Melee, it's possible for your SDI input to have its magnitude stifled by a pull that takes place early on in the SDI range. The magnitude of your SDI can be as little as 70% when this happens. Luckily, SDI can be modernized by making it so that the second frame within the SDI range counts toward your magnitude as well. This allows analog-based controllers to achieve a consistent magnitude of 1.0. To show you an example of where this magnitude improvement can make a difference, take a look at this clip of Fox attempting to slide off Mart's up tilt. Fox isn't able to slide off from this position when he SDIs with 70% magnitude, but when he has 100% magnitude, he's able to make it. The next two issues fall under the category of microscopic range. These two issues are shield drop and 1.0 cardinal. As I mentioned earlier on, the UCF team is in agreement with me and Altimore that both of these mechanics should be addressed, but our methodology is different. I'll start by explaining how Altimore and I fix shield drop differently than the UCF team. On vanilla Melee, the shield drop range is flawed in that it's only a 3Y value range, whereas the other out-of-shield options offer generous ranges which can consistently be pinpointed. UCF 0.84 addresses this by increasing shield drop's range in both directions along the rim. However, Altimore and I aren't fond of the UCF team's decisions here. The first aspect of UCF 0.84's shield drop changes that I ought to criticize is the decision to increase the range upward. Altimore and I personally feel that this change ought to be illegal, as it sets the precedent that we can tamper with shield drop's actuation point. Although the UCF team compensates for this by adding a 1-frame delay to these coordinates to balance things out, it's still preferable for us to avoid the precedents being created here altogether. That brings me to the downward range increase. Altimore and I aren't fond of the fact that UCF's downward cutoff doesn't correspond with anything in-game. If we have no choice but to play game designer, we should look to make things as non-arbitrary as possible. That's why Altimore and I chose to increase shield drop's range by as much as possible by filling it in within the quadrants. Once shield drop is given this range, it resembles the rest of the out-of-shield options, all of which are functional. The improvement Altimore and I gave to shield drop is one of the most important changes in 1.03. Even with UCF's improved range, many players still accidentally spot dodge when they intend to shield drop. The fact that this can never happen on box-style controllers is one of the biggest advantages they have, and so it's only right to bring the GameCube controller up to par. Next up is 1.0 Cardinal. 1.0 Cardinal's one-coordinate range is blatantly flawed on vanilla. The UCF team addressed this on version 0.84 by increasing 1.0 by 6 values in each direction. However, we can take this a step further by maximizing 1.0's range all the way. Just like with shield drop, we shouldn't add any arbitrary values if we're the ones playing game designer, and so this range makes more sense than what the UCF team chose. The next two issues fall under a new category called corridor range. Something important to know about the corridor range category is that both issues which suffer from a corridor range can currently be bypassed through the use of a C-pad, which is a hardware mod that replaces your C-stick with a 4-way directional pad. The Controller Ruleset Committee acknowledges C-pads within their recent proposal document. This is worth noting because it reveals another area in which UCF is currently coming up short. If the Controller Committee's logic is that C-pads ought to be legal, then both of the corridor range software fixes ought to be legal as well, as they should be standardized on a software level for everybody. The first corridor range fix is the more important of the two. In Melee, vertical throws have a faulty stick map in that their range is merely the vertical corridor. This is worse than the vertical tilt stick map, which offers a cone-shaped range. In all of the more recent Smash titles, the game developers corrected this oversight by giving vertical throws a cone-shaped range as well. In Melee, however, you may find that you'll often perform an accidental side throw if you're using an analog stick. This is a game-changing issue which we can fix by giving vertical throws a cone-shaped range. Next, there's an issue with C-stick ledge fall. C-stick ledge fall is hardly viable without digital C-stick buttons due to the fact that it runs the risk of performing an accidental aerial. This happens because if you nudge the C-stick past the corridor after ledge falling, an aerial will come out. This will result in an SD in most situations. However, we can resolve this issue by improving the C-stick ledge fall range to a cone just like vertical throws. Next, there is one last range issue which we ought to cover. In August 2023, Altimore and I discovered that there's an issue with down B when your character is grounded. This issue is so minuscule that it's practically an Easter egg. However, it still warrants fixing. Believe it or not, the game developers wrote a typo in the game's code when they programmed down B. Rather than starting down B at the appropriate coordinate of -0.55, the game developers began the down B range at one coordinate below that. This means that negative 0.55 doesn't correspond with anything on vanilla Melee, which most notably allows the Ice Climbers to perform a neutral B desync which shouldn't exist. Luckily, we can easily correct this by making negative 0.55 correspond with down B as it should. The next and last category is hardware. The sole software fix which falls under this category shouldn't be underestimated, as it's one of the most important fixes overall. In Melee, there's a game-changing issue called ADT shield which occurs when a trigger with a spring in it is pulled in the light shield range followed by the digital shield range on the next frame. This causes your shield to fail to protect you from physical attacks on frames 2 and 3. ADT shield can be avoided by removing the spring from your trigger. However, this creates the disadvantage of not being able to perform other techniques such as light shield and analog L cancel with that trigger. That's why the best way to fix ADT is by modernizing it through software, which is what we've done on 1.03. By making it so that your shield protects you on frames 2 and 3 even when you receive an ADT shield pull, you're able to use a single trigger to perform the techniques I mentioned while remaining immune to ADT. In just a moment, I'll be explaining how this unlocks the best button layout by allowing GameCube controller users to make the most of their hardware. Now that we've gone over all of the faulty mechanics, let's go over 2 cultural shifts which I believe will be crucial in order for the community to resolve its controller legality issues. These are the destigmatization of Z-Jump and the knowledge of the ADT shield button layout. I'll start with the destigmatization of Z-Jump. If you've been paying attention to the general vibes which surround these controller discussions, then you probably caught wind of the fact that a good amount of the Melee community hates Z-Jump. Despite Z-Jump merely being a button remap, it has managed to become controversial among several top pros nonetheless. For those who don't know what Z-Jump is, it refers to the act of swapping Z with X or Y in order to use Z as a jump button. It is widely agreed that this is advantageous due to the fact that Z lets you use a different finger to press buttons such as A, B, and the C stick. While some Melee players may despise this hardware mod, the fact of the matter is that it's a necessary way to create balance between the GameCube controller and box. This is because the box's layout is arguably better than a Z-Jump GameCube controller regardless, and so it's only fair for Z-Jump to be allowed. Thus, the sentiment that Z-Jump is cheating or taboo doesn't help us reach the outcome we need. The Melee community will have to adopt a more progressive mentality and embrace Z-Jump in order to equalize its legal controller archetypes. In order to move forward with this cultural shift, I strongly recommend for Z-Jump to be standardized software side as well. 1.03 does this by offering a portal for Z-Jump as well as a character select screen toggle for it. This comes in handy since not everyone has access to a modder who can install Z-Jump for them. That brings me to the ADT shield button layout, which I believe to be even more interesting and game-changing. Earlier I mentioned that the ADT software fix makes it possible for a single trigger to perform light shield and analog L cancel while remaining immune to ADT. There's an optimal way this should be used that all GameCube controller users ought to know about. Once the ADT software fix is applied, the best way to make use of the GameCube controller's hardware is to use an all-purpose L trigger with your left hand and Z jump with your right hand. The R trigger should then be used to perform wave dash out of shield. This layout is the best way to put the GameCube controller's hardware on par with the box, and it's only possible with an ADT shield software fix. I've included a clip of me using this layout so that you can see it in real time. Next, it's important to know that in a world where the 13 software fixes are made standard, that there are 3 of them which benefit the box. These are dash out of crouch, shield drop, and ADT shield. As you can see, the 1.03 manual mentions that these 3 fixes improve the box. I'll be explaining why this is the case for each of them. The first fix which improves the box is dash out of crouch. This is specifically due to the 3-frame window increase. On the box, dash back out of crouch is still abnormally difficult to perform without this improvement, as you can only hold diagonal for 1 frame at most in order to perform this technique. Once dash out of crouch is increased to 3 frames, however, it'll be much more consistent on the box as well. The second fix which improves the box is shield drop. This is because if you hold modifier Y to tilt horizontally then diagonally, you won't receive a shield drop on UCF, but you will with 1.03's range. This trick is worth knowing about because it takes away the need to press the analog stick all the way against the rim. Finally, ADT Shield improves both controller types by making it so that it's possible to produce an ADT Reflect Sphere while also protecting from physical attacks simultaneously. For those who don't know, the intended purpose of an ADT Shield is to produce a Reflect Sphere which replicates the size of the light shield which took place on the frame before it. This is useful for reflecting projectiles such as Falco's laser. However, what the software fix for ADT Shield allows you to do is protect yourself from physical attacks such as Nair simultaneously. This normally wouldn't be possible on vanilla. While this does violate game integrity, Altimore and I deemed it a necessary evil, as the fact that an ADT Shield sequence won't protect you from physical attacks is a mechanic which needs to be fixed at all costs. The next and last chapter will discuss one last subject, which is the need for Nintendo Wiis going forward. Nintendo Wiis are already somewhat necessary due to the widespread usage of Slippy, but they'll be even more necessary in a world where the new gameplay fixes are standardized. This is because 4 of the fixes require a Wii's processing power in order to create visually stealth versions. These are Daraki Wall Jump, the SDI Remainder fix, and ADT Shield. A Wii can stealth these mechanics by playing the game one frame ahead and producing versions which look identical to vanilla. I'll be rounding out today's video with a recap. First, we discussed UCF's origins and how the box was interrelated with it all along, which is why the push for both of these advancements occurred in 2017. Nowadays, the community ought to reconsider the clunky box nerfs which are on the cusp of being imposed and give more consideration to the clean and enjoyable GameCube controller buffs which have yet to be implemented. These improvements, which can be referred to as either 1.03 or a completed UCF, will breathe fresh air into Melee and give players something huge to look forward to. There are 13 faulty game mechanics in total which need to be addressed. A Z-jump toggle should also be added, and Z-jump should be destigmatized in general, as calling it cheating is not conducive to the end goal. Finally, GameCube controller users should familiarize themselves with the ADT Shield button layout, which involves using L for shield and analog L cancel, and Z for jump. Next, box users should be aware that the dash out of crouch, shield drop, and ADT Shield fixes improve their controller as well. Finally, Nintendo Wiis will be a necessity for tournament organizers going forward so that stealth versions of certain mechanic fixes can be used. As mentioned earlier in the video, I plan to use my Twitch channel to make a serious push for these fixes to be implemented, so please follow me there if you haven't already. From here on out, I'll be streaming plenty of 1.03 content, so stay tuned.